The sound of room service knocking was the second worst thing about waking up. The first was the heavy, elegant weight of an arm draped across my waist. I didn't need to open my eyes to know who it belonged to. The scent of sandalwood and expensive, cold ambition was unmistakable. Julianne, my professional nemesis. The woman who had spent the last 5 years trying to bury my nonprofit under spreadsheets and efficiency audits. And now, she was asleep in my bed, looking devastatingly soft, while the board of directors for both our organizations was likely eating breakfast down the hall. I stared at the ceiling, the headache from top-tier champagne throbbing behind my eyes, and the terrifying reality of the situation settled in. I tried to piece together the timeline, forcing my brain to rewind 24 hours. It started at the Gilded Gala. If you work in humanitarian aid, you know this night. It's the Super Bowl of fundraising, but with more velvet ropes and significantly sharper knives. The air in the ballroom was recycled, thick with the smell of desperation, heavy hors d'oeuvres, and money. I was there for Roots and Reach, the grassroots organization I'd poured my life into. We needed funding to keep the lights on. Julianne was there for Global Impact, the corporate behemoth that treated charity like a merger acquisition. We were both hunting the same prey, Lydia Jensen. The rumor was she had a $10 million check burning a hole in her clutch, and she was looking for a home for it. I stood near the entrance, smoothing the fabric of a dress I couldn't really afford, watching the room. The donor tiers were physically separated by velvet ropes, gold, platinum, and the visionary circle, where Lydia sat. It was gross, it was necessary, and it was a war zone. I felt the exhaustion deep in my bones, that specific burnout that comes from caring too much for too long with too few resources. Then I saw her. Julianne didn't walk into a room, she calibrated it. She wore a suit that probably cost more than my car, tailored to within an inch of its life, sharp lapels cutting through the soft lighting. She was laughing at something a donor said, that practiced, perfect laugh. But then her eyes lifted, scanning the crowd, and locked onto mine. The noise of the gala seemed to drop away. It wasn't just professional jealousy. It never was. It was a physical awareness that hit me in the chest. She nodded, a tiny acknowledging tilt of her head that said, "Game on." But beneath that polish, I thought I saw a flicker of something else, a solitude that matched my own fatigue. I spent the first hour working the room, shaking hands, smiling until my face hurt, pitching our water purification project to anyone holding a glass of wine. But I was hyper-aware of her location at all times. It's like tracking a storm front. You need to know where the pressure is building. I saw her charming the board members, her hand resting lightly on a forearm, her posture open but commanding. She was good. Terrifyingly good. We finally collided by the silent auction tables, right in front of a signed guitar nobody wanted. I was reaching for a catalog. She was reaching for a glass of champagne. Our fingers brushed. The static shock was real, snapping between us. "You're looking tired, Sarah," she said. Her voice was low, smooth, like dark chocolate with a bitter aftertaste. "Grassroots work finally wearing you down?" "I'm looking authentic, Julianne," I shot back, keeping my voice level, though my pulse jumped. "Some of us don't have a marketing budget to airbrush our exhaustion." She took a sip of her drink, her gaze lingering on my mouth for a fraction of a second too long. It felt intrusive. It felt hot. "Efficiency prevents exhaustion," she countered. "You run on adrenaline. It's not sustainable." "It's passion," I said, stepping closer. I shouldn't have, but the pull was there, magnetic and dangerous. And Lydia Jensen responds to passion, not spreadsheets. Julianne smiled, and it wasn't her donor smile. It was smaller, sharper, almost private. Lydia Jensen responds to results, and I intend to show her mine tonight. Good luck getting past her handlers, I said, turning back to the table to hide the flush rising in my neck. I heard she's not taking pitches until the after party. Then I guess I'll see you on the roof, she murmured, her breath catching just slightly against my ear as she leaned in to grab a brochure. The scent of sandalwood hit me then, grounding and heady, wrapping around me. I watched her walk away, the line of her back straight and unyielding. My heart was hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with fundraising. The main event was ending, speeches were wrapping up, but I knew the real danger was just beginning. The night was far from over. The elevator ride to the penthouse roof felt like a rapid decompression. The air up there was different, thinner, colder, and vibrating with a heavy synthetic bass line that rattled the ice in my glass. If the ballroom downstairs was a battlefield, the VIP after party was the demilitarized zone where everyone pretended they weren't still keeping score. Ties were loosened, heels were kicked off under high-top tables, and the lighting dropped to a sultry, forgiving amber that blurred the sharp edges of the day. I navigated the crowd, dodging a board member who desperately wanted to discuss synergy over another drink, and slipped out the side glass doors onto the terrace. I needed 5 minutes, just 5 minutes of silence, before I had to turn the charm back on and hunt for Lydia Jensen in the dim light. I walked to the far edge of the balcony, where the city skyline bled into the low, heavy clouds. But I wasn't alone. A silhouette was leaning against the stone railing, shoulders hunched in a posture that screamed, "Do not approach." It was Julianne, and she was hiding. I hesitated, my instinct to retreat warring with a sudden, perverse curiosity. She turned before I could decide, catching me hovering in the shadows. She didn't scowl. She looked relieved. "If you're here to talk about quarterly projections," she said, her voice competing with the wind, "I might actually jump." "I was actually here to hide from the guy who keeps saying the word synergy," I admitted, moving to the railing beside her. I kept a safe distance, 2 feet of cold stone between us. "But if you're jumping, I get your donor list." She huffed a laugh, a genuine, unpracticed sound that seemed to surprise us both. She looked different out here. The armor had cracked. Her hair was slightly wind-blown, losing that severe, perfect spray hold. And she looked tired. Not the professional fatigue she wore like a badge of honor, but a deep, human exhaustion that mirrored my own. "It's a circus," she murmured, looking out at the grid of traffic far below. "We dance, we beg, we drink terrible wine, and we hope someone feels guilty enough to write a check." Cynicism? From the woman who trademarked global optimism? I teased, but my voice was soft. "Realism," she corrected. She turned to face me, resting her hip against the stone. The city lights reflected in her dark eyes, turning them liquid. "I'm just off the clock. For 10 minutes. 10 minutes, I echoed. The air between us thickened, heavy and charged. It wasn't the sharp, competitive static from the ballroom. This was slower, heavier. "I bet you can't do it." "Excuse me?" "Disconnect," I challenged, turning to face her fully. "No pitching, no strategizing, just being human. For 1 hour. Julianne raised an eyebrow, a challenge sparking in her gaze. "Is that a dare, Sarah?" "It's a survival strategy." She studied me, her gaze dropping to my lips, then back up. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and without thinking, I reached out to tuck it behind her ear. My fingers brushed her temple. Her skin was warm, startlingly soft against the cold night air. I froze. I should have pulled back. I didn't. Julianne didn't pull away either. She leaned into my touch, just a fraction of an inch, her eyes fluttering shut. The noise of the party behind the glass doors faded into a dull hum. My thumb traced the line of her jaw, feeling the tension there, the clench of muscle slowly releasing under my hand. The scent of sandalwood was stronger here, mixed with the crisp night air. 1 hour, she whispered, her voice rougher now. She opened her eyes, and the look in them knocked the wind out of me. It wasn't rivalry. It was hunger. But we can't do it here. No, I agreed, my voice barely working. Too many eyes. I have a car waiting, she said, the words rushing out like a confession, low and urgent. To the hotel. We can share. To share, I repeated, the lie tasting sweet and dangerous on my tongue. It was a flimsy excuse, transparent as glass, but neither of us cared. Eco-friendly, we walked back through the party, moving with a synchronized urgency, not looking at anyone. We didn't touch, but the space between us felt like a live wire, humming with potential energy. We bypassed the valet line, bypassed the desperate networking circles, and slipped into the back of her waiting black sedan. The leather was cool, the windows tinted against the world. When the heavy door clicked shut, sealing us in the quiet dark, the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting, heavy with the promise of that 1 hour we had stolen. The transition from the night's haze to the morning's sharp edge was violent. I felt the exact moment consciousness hit her. The arm draped over my waist didn't withdraw slowly. It retracted, like a tactical error being corrected. Julianne sat up, the heavy hotel sheets pooling around her waist, and for one suspended second, she looked devastatingly soft. Her hair was a tangled halo, her lips swollen, her guard completely down. I saw the woman who had whispered my name in the dark, the one who had let out a shaky breath when my hands found her waist. But then the memory of who we were rushed back in, and I watched the walls slam back into place. Her spine straightened, her eyes sharpened. She was checking the time on the digital bedside clock before she even looked at me. "It's 7, I whispered, my voice sounding like gravel scraped over velvet. My head throbbed, a rhythmic reminder of the champagne and the adrenaline crash. Julianne turned to me. The intimacy of the car ride, the heat that had filled this room only hours ago, it was gone, replaced by immediate damage control. "The board breakfast is at 8, she said. Not good morning, not how did we get here? Just logistics. The regional directors are down the hall. We need to be careful, I said, sitting up and pulling the sheet against my chest. The air conditioning felt suddenly freezing. If anyone saw us come up... They didn't, she cut in, her tone clipped. But they can't see you leave. This... She gestured between us, a vague, dismissive hand wave that stung more than an insult. This is a liability, for both of us. We are professionals, Sarah. We are rivals. It was a lapse, I agreed, trying to convince myself the ache in my chest was just a hangover. Stress relief. A glitch in the system. Exactly, she said, though her gaze lingered on my bare shoulder for a fraction of a second too long. It never happened. Then, the knock came. It wasn't a tentative tap. It was 3 sharp, authoritative raps that sounded like a gavel. We both froze. The silence in the room went from awkward to suffocating in a heartbeat. "Ms. Sterling?" A voice came through the heavy wood. "It's Marcus. Lydia Jensen wanted to ensure you received the updated itinerary for the brunch." Marcus, Lydia's personal assistant. The man who knew every secret in the nonprofit world before it even happened. If he saw me here, the director of a scrappy grassroots org in the corporate suite of her main competitor, it wasn't just a scandal, it was professional suicide. It would look like collusion, or worse, incompetence. I rolled off the bed, hitting the floor in a silent crouch. My dress was a heap of emerald silk near the balcony door, a casualty of our urgency. I crawled toward it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Julianne didn't panic. She went still, that predator stillness she used in high-stakes negotiations. "Just a moment, Marcus," she called out. Her voice was steady, terrifyingly normal. She pointed sharply at the bathroom. I gathered my clothes, my heels, and my dignity and bolted for the marble sanctuary. I pressed the door shut just as I heard the main lock click open. I stood in the dark, clutching my dress to my chest, listening to the muffled exchange, the rustle of paper, the polite pleasantries, the sound of Julianne lying with effortless grace. Thank you, Marcus. I'll review it immediately. The door clicked shut. The lock engaged. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and stepped back out. Julianne was leaning against the doorframe, eyes closed, looking pale. The adrenaline was fading, leaving us both exposed. You need to go, she said, opening her eyes. The softness was gone completely now. The service elevator is down the hall to the left. It dumps out near the kitchen loading dock. Classy, I muttered, stepping into my dress. The zipper felt cold against my skin. Safe, she corrected. The walk back to my own room was a blur of paranoia. I avoided eye contact with the housekeeping staff, clutching my shoes in one hand, the plush carpet feeling rough under my bare feet. It wasn't a walk of shame. I wasn't ashamed of the desire. I was ashamed of the vulnerability. She had seen me unravel. She had seen the parts of me I kept hidden behind grant proposals and field reports. Back in my room, I stood under the hottest water the shower could muster, scrubbing the scent of sandalwood and cold ambition off my skin. I watched the water swirl down the drain, telling myself it was over. We were professionals. We would go back to the city, go back to our corners, and fight for Lydia Jensen's money like we always did. I put on my armor, blazer, slacks, sensible heels, and convinced myself I was safe. I believed it, right up until Monday morning, when the email blasted out to every nonprofit director in the city. The email subject line was simple: update on funding decision. I opened it expecting a rejection. Instead, I found a summons. Lydia Jensen hadn't chosen a winner. She had chosen a merger. Not of organizations, but of methods. She wanted the authentic community trust of my team paired with the scalable infrastructure of Julianne's. It was a $10 million experiment, and we were the lab rats. Walking into the boardroom at Jensen Trust felt like walking into a sentencing hearing. The room was all glass and chrome, suspended high above the city, designed to make you feel small. Julianne was already there. Of course she was. She sat at the long mahogany table, iPad aligned perfectly with the edge, a fresh notebook open, pen uncapped. She was wearing a pearl gray suit that looked like it was made of steel wool and discipline. Her hair was pulled back so tight it must have hurt. When I entered, she didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She just tapped the screen of her tablet, scrolling through data that I assumed was a list of reasons why working with me was a bad idea. Lydia breezed in moments later, smelling of expensive lilies and old money. She laid it out. 6 weeks, a joint task force, a shared office space in a neutral building. We had to build a pilot program that utilized both our strengths. If we succeeded, the trust would fund the rollout. If we failed, neither of us got a dime. I see a fire in both of you, Lydia said, looking between us with a terrifying sort of benevolence. I want to see what happens when that heat is directed at the same target. I risked a glance at Julianne. She was nodding, that professional, engaged nod. But I saw the tension in her jaw, the way her grip on her pen turned her knuckles white. She was furious. Or maybe she was terrified. It was hard to tell the difference with her. The neutral office turned out to be a glass-walled fishbowl in a co-working space downtown. It was small, intimate. There was nowhere to hide. For the first week, we circled each other like boxers in the late rounds, tired, wary, waiting for the other one to drop their guard. The friction was immediate and exhausting. My desk was a chaotic ecosystem of sticky notes, field maps, and coffee cups. Hers was a sterile surface of white space and calculated efficiency. You can't quantify hope, Julianne, I argued on day 3, slamming a stack of community surveys onto the table between us. These people need to know we're listening, not just mining them for data points. She looked up from her spreadsheet, her gaze cool and level. And you can't fund hope with good vibes, Sarah. Without the metrics to prove viability, your listening tour is just an expensive hobby. The argument was familiar. It was the same song we'd been singing at panels and galas for years. But the acoustics had changed. In that small room, with the rain streaking the glass and the hum of the server room next door, the frustration felt heavy, physical. Every time she critiqued my strategy, I remembered the way her breath had hitched when I touched her waist. Every time I pushed back against her rigidity, I remembered how she had melted against the stone railing of the balcony. We were fighting about budget allocations, but the subtext was screaming. When she leaned over my shoulder to point at a flaw in my proposal, the scent of sandalwood hit me like a physical blow, paralyzing my thought process. When I accidentally brushed her arm, reaching for a marker, she recoiled as if burned, then immediately smoothed her sleeve, her eyes dark and unreadable. "I disagree with your approach," she said during a strategy session, her voice dropping an octave, tight with restraint. "I know," I replied, holding her gaze, refusing to blink. "You prefer things controlled, safe. I prefer things that work," she countered, stepping closer, invading my personal space under the guise of intimidation. "Chaos isn't a strategy, Sarah. It's a risk." "Maybe you need a little risk," I murmured. The air in the room seemed to vanish. She stared at me, her lips parted slightly, the professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the panic and the want underneath. For a moment, I thought she was going to argue. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel, returning to her side of the room. "Review the budget lines by morning," she said, her back to me. "We're done for today." But we weren't done. We were just getting started. And as the weeks ground on, the line between professional friction and personal desire started to blur, until I couldn't tell if we were trying to kill each other or just trying to survive the inevitable collision. By the 3rd week, the boundaries of our shared existence had shrunk to the 4 glass walls of that office. It was 11:14 on a Tuesday night, and the rest of the city had long since gone home to their lives, their families, and their sanity. We were still here. Outside, a relentless autumn rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the lights of the skyline into smeared, weeping streaks of gold and red. Inside, the only sounds were the hum of the HVAC system and the soft, rhythmic click of Julianne's keyboard. We had ordered takeout an hour ago. Pad Thai from the place around the corner that stayed open late for people like us. People who had replaced their circadian rhythms with caffeine and ambition. The carton sat open on the table between us, a messy centerpiece of noodles and lime wedges amidst the pristine landscape of Julianne's architectural plans. "You're going to burn a hole in that screen," I said, breaking the silence. My voice sounded too loud in the empty room. "The budget isn't going to change just because you glare at it." Julianne stopped typing. She didn't look up immediately. She took a slow breath, her shoulders dropping about an inch. It was the first time I'd seen her posture falter all day. She pulled her glasses off, rubbing the bridge of her nose, and for a second, the formidable director of global impact vanished. In her place was just a woman who was tired. "It's not the budget," she murmured, her eyes still closed. "It's the projection for the 3rd quarter. If we don't hit the engagement metrics, the trust pulls the 2nd tranche of funding. And if they pull the funding, my board will use it as leverage to oust me." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "Oust you? You built that department from the ground up. You're their golden girl." She finally looked at me, and the vulnerability in her dark eyes was startling. It was raw, unpolished, and terrifyingly honest. "Gold is heavy, Sarah, and it's soft. It dents easily." She pushed her chair back, turning to face the rain-streaked window. You think I'm a machine. Everyone does. But the machine only works because I never, ever let them see the gears grinding. I have to be perfect. Every day, every meeting. If I slip, even once, I'm not passionate like you. I'm emotional. I'm unstable. I'm a liability. The bitterness in her voice wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the world that demanded she be made of steel. I felt a crack in my own chest, a sudden, sharp empathy that cut through weeks of professional friction. I'm not passionate, I admitted quietly, staring at my hands. I'm terrified. I run on panic. I'm so scared that one day I'm going to wake up and realize I've burned out, that I have nothing left to give, and the people counting on me will be the ones who suffer for it. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was intimate. It was the sound of two enemies laying down their weapons because they were too exhausted to hold them up anymore. Julianne turned back to the table. She reached for the file I had been working on, the Community Impact Assessment. I reached for it at the same time, intending to close it. Our hands collided over the manila folder. It wasn't a brush this time. It was a collision. My fingers landed on top of hers, and neither of us pulled away. Her skin was warm, shocking against the cool air of the office. I felt the delicate bones of her hand beneath mine, the strength in her fingers. I looked up, and she was already looking at me. The air in the room changed instantly. The humidity of the rain seemed to seep through the glass, making the atmosphere thick, heavy, unbreathable. The spreadsheets, the grant money, the board of directors, it all dissolved. The only thing that existed was the heat of her hand under mine and the dark, dilated pull of her pupils. "Sarah," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. I didn't move my hand. I couldn't. "We shouldn't be doing this." "We're not doing anything," she said, but her voice was breathless, low and rough. She turned her hand over slowly, interlacing her fingers with mine. The friction of skin against skin sent a jolt straight to my spine. "We're just working." "Is this working?" I asked, my voice barely a murmur. She leaned in. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a tide coming in. I leaned to meet her, drawn by a gravity I had stopped trying to fight. I could smell the sandalwood again, warmer now, mixed with the scent of rain and coffee. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, asking for permission, or maybe forgiveness. We were inches away. I could feel the warmth of her breath against my cheek. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would bruise my ribs. The tension coiled tight, a physical ache demanding release. I tilted my head, my eyes fluttering shut, ready to cross the line that would ruin everything. Clack! The roar of an industrial vacuum cleaner shattered the moment like a hammer through glass. We sprang apart as if we'd been shot. The door to the suite was propped open, and a member of the cleaning crew was backing in, headphones on, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just interrupted the collapse of my entire professional worldview. Julianne was standing by the window before I could even blink, her back to me, smoothing her blazer with shaking hands. I sat frozen at the table, my hand still tingling where hers had been, staring at the man vacuuming the carpet. The spell was broken, but the danger wasn't gone. It had just mutated. We weren't just risking our jobs anymore. We were risking our hearts. The Silver Creek Lodge sat isolated at the edge of the tree line, a sprawling architecture of timber and stone that smelled of pine needles and old money. This was the final gauntlet, a 72-hour retreat where the top contenders pitched directly to the Trust's inner circle. The isolation was supposed to foster focus, but for us, it just compressed the atmosphere until the air felt flammable. We were miles from the city, miles from our teams, and trapped in a luxury pressure cooker with open bars and competitors who smelled blood. I spent the first evening trying to memorize the bios of the trustees, but my eyes kept drifting. Julianne was holding court near the stone fireplace. She looked effortless, wearing a silk blouse the color of deep wine that caught the firelight every time she moved. But she wasn't looking at me. She was laughing, genuinely laughing, at something David from the Clean Water Coalition had said. David was charming, successful, and blatantly flirting. He leaned in too close, his hand hovering near her elbow, his posture open and inviting. A spike of jealousy hit me so hard it almost knocked the wind out of me. It wasn't the professional envy I was used to. I wasn't jealous that he was networking. I was jealous that he was making her smile. I was jealous of the way her attention, usually a laser focused on me, had shifted to someone else. It was irrational. It was possessive. And it was dangerous. I gripped my drink until my knuckles turned white, watching them. Every time David touched her arm, a dark, ugly heat coiled in my stomach. I told myself I was worried about the project, that she was losing focus, that she was letting a rival get too close to our strategy. But the lie tasted like ash. I wasn't worried about the strategy. I was worried that the connection we had built in the dark of that office was just a figment of my exhaustion, easily replaced by a man in a better suit. When Julianne finally excused herself and headed toward the guest cabins, I didn't think. I set my glass down and followed. The night air was biting, sharp with the scent of snow, but I didn't feel the cold. I caught up to her on the illuminated path, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. "You're losing focus," I called out, my voice snapping through the quiet. Julianne turned, startled, her hand tightening on her coat. When she saw it was me, her expression hardened. "Excuse me?" "David," I said, catching up to her, breathing hard. "You spent 2 hours charming him. We have the final presentation prep at 7 tomorrow, and you're treating this like a cocktail hour." "I was gathering intel," she countered, her voice cool and dismissive. "He's worried about his overhead costs. I found a weakness. It's called strategy, Sarah. You should try it." "It looked like flirting," I accused, the words slipping out before I could check them. Julianne stopped walking. She turned fully toward me, her eyes narrowing. We were standing in the shadow of her cabin door. "And if it was, why do you care? Are you worried about the grant? Or are you worried about me?" "I'm worried you're forgetting why we're here," I lied, stepping into her space. "I haven't forgotten anything," she whispered. She didn't back down. She stepped closer, eliminating the safety of the distance between us. "But you're not angry about the project. You're angry because he touched me." "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" She tilted her head, her gaze dropping to my lips. "You've been watching me all night. I could feel it. You're jealous, Sarah." "I'm not jealous," I hissed. But the denial was weak. The tension that had been building for weeks, through arguments, late nights, and almost touches, finally snapped. "I just don't like seeing you waste your time on people who don't understand you." "And you do?" she challenged softly. "You think you understand me?" "I know you," I said, my voice dropping to a rough whisper. "I know you're terrified. I know you're lonely. And I know you don't want him." "Then who do I want?" The question hung in the freezing air, a dare. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I closed the gap and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a collision of frustration and desperate need. My hands found her waist, gripping the silk of her blouse, pulling her against me. She made a low sound in her throat and surged forward, her hands tangling in my hair, her mouth hot and demanding against mine. We stumbled back until her back hit the solid wood of the cabin door. The world narrowed down to this: the taste of her, the cold wind, and the heat radiating between us. It wasn't a mistake. It felt like the only honest thing we had done in 5 years. I pulled back just an inch, gasping for air, our foreheads resting together. "Tell me to stop," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Don't you dare," she breathed, her eyes dark and wrecked. "This isn't about the grant anymore, Sarah. It hasn't been for a long time." "I know," I admitted, the fight finally draining out of me. "I know." We stood there, in the dark, shivering not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. And for the first time, neither of us wanted to go back. We didn't stop fighting the current. We let it pull us under. For the next 48 hours, the Silver Creek Lodge became a landscape of dual realities. In the conference rooms, under the bright halogen lights, we were professional partners, pitching a revolutionary aid model. We spoke in clear, clipped sentences about budget allocation and impact metrics. But beneath that surface layer, in the quiet spaces between the itinerary, we were something else entirely. It was a secret language of proximity. It was the way her knee pressed firmly against mine under the heavy oak table during breakfast. A steady, grounding weight while she calmly discussed supply chains with a trustee. It was a stolen 10 minutes in the dusty silence of the lodge's library, where she pressed me back against a row of encyclopedias, her hands mapping the tension in my shoulders, her mouth hot and urgent against my neck. We didn't talk about what would happen when we went back. We lived in the pockets of time where no one was watching, hoarding the intimacy like it was a finite resource. Because we both knew, deep down, that it was. The reality check hit the moment the tires of the black SUV hit the city pavement. The bubble didn't just pop. It shattered against the concrete skyline. We returned to our separate offices, separate lives, and the looming pressure of the final gala, now only 3 days away. The silence of the snow was replaced by the relentless noise of phones ringing and emails pinging with urgent demands. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a fundraising projection that suddenly felt meaningless, when my board chair, Alan, walked in. He looked stressed, holding a coffee cup like a weapon. "I'm hearing rumors, Sarah," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "People are saying Julianne has been remarkably cooperative. Too cooperative." "We're building a partnership, Alan," I said, keeping my voice even, then my pulse picked up. He laughed, a dry, cynical sound. "Be careful. You're metaphorically sleeping with the enemy, and Julianne Sterling doesn't share a bed unless she plans to steal the blankets. She's playing an angle. She always is." The comment was meant to be a warning about corporate strategy, but it landed like a physical blow. Sleeping with the enemy. The words echoed in my head, twisting the memory of her warmth into something sharp and suspicious. The insecurity I had buried under the sheets at the lodge clawed its way back up. I was the grassroots dreamer. She was the corporate shark. Of course she had an angle. I needed to see her. I told myself it was to discuss the final pitch deck, but really, I needed to look at her eyes and see the woman who had held me in the dark, not the predator Alan described. I walked to the co-working space we still technically shared. The main room was empty, but the light was on in the small, glass-walled conference room at the back. I approached quietly, the carpet swallowing the sound of my heels. Julianne was there, pacing. She had her phone pressed to her ear, her posture rigid. She looked like the director of Global Impact again, armor on, walls up. I reached for the handle, then froze. "I know what I have to do, Lydia," she was saying, her voice muffled but audible through the glass. "Sarah doesn't need to be involved in this part. I can secure the leverage for the solo funding if the board rejects the joint proposal. Yes, I'm prepared to make the cut." The blood drained from my face. Solo funding. Make the cut. The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. I stepped back, my hand trembling. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a confirmation of my worst fear. that I was just a variable in her equation, a distraction she had managed until she could secure the real prize. The intimacy, the vulnerability, the way she had looked at me in the library, it was all just data acquisition. I slammed the door open. Julianne spun around, her eyes widening. She lowered the phone slowly. Sarah? I was just securing the leverage, I interrupted, my voice shaking with a rage that felt dangerously close to heartbreak. Making the cut? Was that the plan all along, Julianne? Get me to lower my guard, get me to trust you, and then gut my organization when the check gets signed? You don't understand, she started, stepping toward me. I understand perfectly, I snapped, backing away. Alan was right. You don't have partners, you have targets. And I was stupid enough to think I was the exception. She stopped. The hurt flashed across her face for a single, raw second. A crack in the ice. But then, as she looked at the accusation in my eyes, the crack sealed over. Her spine straightened. Her expression smoothed into something cool and unreadable. The Ice Queen was back. If that's what you think of me, she said, her voice devoid of the warmth I had tasted only hours ago, then there's nothing I can say that you'll believe. Good, I choked out. Then we'll stick to the script at the gala. Professional, efficient, dead. I turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the glass box. I didn't look back. If I had, I might have seen her sink into the chair, head in her hands. But I didn't. I just kept walking, letting the anger burn out the ache, convincing myself that I had escaped before she could destroy me completely. I was wrong. The destruction was already done. The ballroom was brighter this time, sharper, as if the lighting technicians had decided to expose every flaw in the room. The Victory Gala was supposed to be a celebration of the funding announcement, but to me, it felt like a high-gloss funeral. The champagne tasted flat, metallic against my tongue. The camera flashes felt like lightning strikes preceding a storm I had no shelter from. I stood in the back, near the sound booth, hiding in the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. I couldn't bear to be on the floor, couldn't bear to make polite conversation with donors who treated humanitarian aid like a tax write-off. I was just waiting for the inevitable axe to fall. The moment Julianne would take the stage, announce Global Impact had secured the solo grant, and prove that I was exactly as naive as she had always claimed. Lydia Jensen took the podium first, smiling that enigmatic billionaire smile that revealed nothing. She introduced the future of philanthropy with a wave of her diamond-clad hand and gestured to stage right. Julianne walked out. She looked impeccable, of course. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue, structured and severe, her hair pulled back, her face a mask of absolute control. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at the cameras or the board members sitting in the front row like judges at a tribunal. She looked straight at the back of the room, straight into the shadows, where she knew I was hiding. She stepped to the microphone. The room went silent. I held my breath, bracing for the knife, my hand clutching the velvet curtain like a lifeline. For the last decade, Julianne began, her voice steady and amplified, filling the cavernous space. I have built my career on a single, unshakable principle, that efficiency saves lives. That if we just optimize the supply chain, if we just balance the ledger and eliminate the variables, we can solve the world's problems. She paused. She looked down at her prepared speech, the index cards resting on the podium. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that sent a ripple of visible confusion through the front row, she turned the cards over, face down. I was wrong, she said. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The board members for Global Impact exchanged nervous, sharp glances. This wasn't the script. Efficiency is safe, Julianne continued, her voice gaining a new, resonant texture. the same raw texture it had held in the dark of our shared office when the rain hammered against the glass. But safety doesn't change the world. Passion does. Risk does. Over the last 6 weeks, I have had the privilege of working with a partner who taught me that you cannot quantify hope. You cannot put a metric on the human spirit, and you certainly cannot automate trust. My heart stopped beating. She wasn't pitching herself. She was pitching us. We were asked to compete, she said, her eyes locking onto mine across the sea of tuxedos and gowns, ignoring the teleprompter entirely, to prove which method was superior. But the truth is, neither works alone. The structure needs the chaos. The head needs the heart. She took a breath, and I saw her hand tremble slightly on the podium, the only sign of the terrified woman beneath the armor. I am not accepting the solo funding tonight, because the work requires a partnership. It requires a joint initiative, one where we don't just count the lives we save, but we actually see them. The silence was absolute. She was going rogue. She was publicly rejecting Lydia Jensen's premise and forcing the trust's hand. If they said no now, they would look like they didn't care about the heart of the mission. It was a gamble of massive proportions. She was betting her entire reputation, her career, her golden girl status on a proposal that hadn't been approved. She was burning the bridge back to her safe, solitary tower. Some might call this a liability, Julianne said, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. A private smile, one I recognized from a rooftop terrace weeks ago. I call it the only way forward. If we want to build a legacy, we have to build it together. She stepped back from the microphone. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. The board looked furious. Lydia Jensen looked stunned. And then, slowly, Lydia started to clap. It was rhythmic and decisive. The room followed suit, the applause swelling from polite confusion to a roar of approval. Julianne didn't smile at the crowd. She walked off stage, bypassing the VIP stairs, heading straight for the side exit. She wasn't trying to win the money. She was trying to win me. I didn't wait. I pushed off the wall, ignoring the gala, ignoring the cameras, and ran toward the door where she had disappeared. The applause faded behind me, replaced by the frantic thudding of my own heart. She had jumped. She had actually jumped. And now I had to catch her. I found her in a narrow service corridor behind the stage, the heavy velvet curtain dampening the roar of applause to a dull, rhythmic thrum. She was leaning against the concrete wall, eyes closed, one hand pressed flat against the cool surface as if trying to ground herself. She looked like she'd just defused a bomb, or maybe detonated one. "You went off script," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the concrete space. Julianne opened her eyes. The fear was there, raw and unmasked. But beneath it was a terrifying sort of calm. "I rewrote the script," she corrected, pushing off the wall to face me. The old one wasn't working. I stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking until I could smell the sandalwood perfume that had haunted me for weeks. "I heard you on the phone, Julianne. You said you were making the cut. I thought..." "You thought I was cutting you," she finished, a pained smile touching her lips. She shook her head, a strand of hair falling loose from her severe bun. "I was cutting the board, Sarah. I told Lydia that if they forced me to choose between the funding and the partnership, I would resign. I was making the cut from them." The realization hit me like a physical weight, knocking the air from my lungs. She hadn't been plotting against me. She had been burning down her own safety net to ensure I had a place to stand. "You risked your career," I whispered, reaching out to touch the lapel of her midnight blue gown. My fingers trembled against the silk. "For a pilot program? For a grassroots theory?" "For you," she said, her voice dropping to that low, intimate register that made my knees weak. She covered my hand with hers, pressing it against her chest. I could feel her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I can get another job, Sarah. I can build another strategy. But I cannot go back to that penthouse alone. I can't go back to a life where the only thing keeping me warm is a balance sheet. I thought you were playing an angle, I admitted, the guilt sharp in my throat. I was, she murmured, stepping into my space, her eyes dark and searching. My angle was us. It always has been. I didn't wait for permission this time. I pulled her in, my hands tangling in the hair she kept so perfectly controlled. When I kissed her, it wasn't the desperate, angry collision of the cabin. It wasn't the stolen, frantic heat of the office. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a claiming. She melted against me, the tension of the gala dissolving into the warmth of her body. Her hands gripped my waist, anchoring herself, her mouth moving against mine with a softness that promised this wasn't temporary. It was the answer to every argument we'd ever had. We have to go back out there, she whispered against my lips, not pulling away. Let them wait, I murmured back. They're waiting for the check, she said, a laugh bubbling up in her throat. And the scandal. Let's give them both. We walked back into the ballroom, not through the side door, but through the main archway. We didn't hide. I didn't walk behind her. I walked beside her, my hand brushing hers in full view of the cameras. The room went quiet as we approached the visionary circle. Lydia Jensen was waiting for us, a glass of champagne in each hand. She looked at Julianne, then at me, her gaze dropping to the space between us, where the air was still charged with electricity. Finally, Lydia said, handing a glass to Julianne. Her eyes crinkled at the corners. I was wondering how long it would take you two to realize that the friction wasn't professional. Julianne blinked, the composure slipping. You knew? Lydia raised her glass in a toast. My dear, I didn't offer $10 million for a merger. I offered it for a marriage of minds. You were just the last ones to figure it out. Cheers. The morning light hit the sheets differently this time. There was no panic, no headache, no scrambling for clothes in the dark. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sight of Julianne reading the financial section in bed, wearing one of my old t-shirts. She looked over the paper, arching a brow. We have a strategy meeting at 10, she said, deadpan. I'm firing you, I mumbled, pulling the pillow over my head. You can't. I'm the efficiency expert. She pulled the pillow down and kissed me, tasting like coffee and peace. The rivalry hadn't ended. It had just evolved into a partnership that kept us both sharp. If you've ever found love in the last place you should have looked, hit subscribe and share your story in the comments.